And we had 261 million people in the country in 1995, 25% less than we do now.
It's a tricky situation that appraisers are in, and others in the process, once the deal's done, they get the money and on they go, but the appraisers still have, some potential liability.
If Trump wins in November, they're going to rush to file a lot of charges and complaints against appraisers.
Episode 17, Market Moves with Mark and Jeff. Jeff, it is election season here, and it seems like more is at stake every year. It feels like, if you listen to the pundits out there. But what does it mean for housing? What does it mean for appraisal? I think this is a question on a lot of people's minds, a lot of our listeners' minds, and something that you and I think a bit about, in at least to the degree that we can control anything or be prepared. So we thought it'd be great here to have an extended discussion about policy differences between the Republican and Democrat sides. Want to be very careful and intentional in not choosing or siding on any particular thing, but really have an informative discussion here. So excited to be doing that.
You bet. If people are hoping for fireworks and a fiery political discussion and debate, I think they'll probably be disappointed. Although I did think it'd be kind of funny to make one of us take each side and argue back and forth, calling each other names and all of the typical kind of political rhetoric that you get in, like political talk shows. But I think we're more interested in, we've got two candidates. It's been interesting to hear that they do have some stated policies. And so we're bringing in somebody who's smarter than us. Fortunately, that bar remains low to clear. And so it's easy to find people to bring in that are intelligent on most things that we're talking about. But excited to welcome in from the Appraisal Institute, Mr. Scott DiBiasio. I'll bring him into the conversation here.
Jeff, and as you're doing that, just a quick introduction with Scott. I've known Scott. Scott, I think it would surprise both of us how long we might have known one another through efforts at the Appraisal Institute. But I bet that it is close to 15 years or longer. You were the manager of state and industry affairs at the Appraisal Institute for, 16 years, and recently took on the role of director of government affairs. And so we go a long ways back, and really excited to have you here to discuss some of the policy differences between the two parties here and what we could be looking at, and maybe some similarities. I don't think there's a better person here to be talking about that as far as I'm concerned. So welcome to Market Moves.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you, Jeff. I appreciate the invitation to be with you all. And I will share what I can, but I don't expect to have all of the answers or to know all of the policies and positions of the two candidates. But I'm happy to share what I know and to have a conversation with you about that.
You bet. Mark likes to try to flex on me. I've worked with and known you for a number of years as well, Scott. Probably not as many as you and Mark, but I've enjoyed you associating with you, through our efforts or at least my efforts at the Utah Appraiser State Board, throughout that tenure and even beyond. But really have come to appreciate your perspective on just what's going on out there in government, both at the federal level and at the state level, and how it touches. I know your focus is probably primarily on appraisal and valuation related issues, but I think the discussion we're going to have here today is probably a little bit more broad than just appraisal, given that there are some policy objectives or guidelines that each of the candidates have stated, and how they go about it. I'm interested to get your perspective on. But maybe to kick things off, Scott, what at a high level, what are you seeing as far as each candidate's approach on what they're trying to accomplish within housing in the United States if elected?
Sure, Jeff. And I think this is the first time in my recollection where both major party candidates have housing affordability and housing availability at the top of their policy agendas if they were to become president. And each of the candidates has a stated goal of trying to put in production 3 million new housing units during their 4-year term. Now, how they get to that and the tactics that and the strategies and the policies that they put in place to accomplish that obviously are somewhat different. Although there are a lot of things that I think they would do the same in terms of utilizing excess federal buildings for rental housing, building new housing stock on federal land, whether abandoned military bases, whatever it may be, and then obviously Trump focuses much more on the free market and the tax incentives that go along with that, while Vice President Harris is much more of a government interventionist and thinks that government can put in place policies to spur the construction of affordable housing. What's kind of interesting, of course, housing has always been at the top of the agenda for Vice President Harris when she was the Attorney General in California. She put several proposals into the California legislature to try to spur the production of affordable housing. She continued that when she went into the U.S. Senate, and obviously she's proposing to continue that policy, that line of policy thinking if she were to be elected president. So it's really, and of course, Trump is a real estate guy, so he knows the markets very well. He knows how to utilize the free market to generate new affordable housing. And I think he's going to, his policies will reflect that. What's kind of interesting is in some of the places where they have, and I'm talking outside the two presidential candidates now, but in some of the places like California and Washington State where they have tried to spur the construction of more affordable housing through things like light touch density, getting rid of zoning, things like that. The impact has actually been only for the most part, to create more unaffordable housing, rather than. So it's not a supply and demand kind of issue here, where when you increase supply, naturally prices should fall, but that's not the case. They'll take a lot that maybe has $1 million house on it, scrape the land, and put up $750,000 condos, and they haven't really addressed the housing affordability crisis in any way. And I put some of that blame on the builders. Obviously, they're opportunists, and they're going to take advantage of whatever they can do with the parcel. So in Washington State, they're still very much working on this, and I'll be interested to see what the impact is there. But I'm of the belief that the Seattle area specifically, that you're just going to see more unaffordable housing rather than to get to the affordable housing.
Well, Scott, I wanted to share just for context here this discussion. Jeff, you and I touched on it on episode 16, I think. Is we were talking about the housing bubble in terms of affordability and comparing it back to the great financial crisis, and we had mentioned the absence of new construction for a long period post the GFC, and I just wanted to add this chart here on the screen for viewers that shows kind of the pace of home construction from basically the early 90s to today, and it's ramping up quickly here. But boy, did it bottom out in 2011 or 2012. We've talked on this podcast quite a bit about just in Houston, my experience. I've got 7 or 8 lower income, lower end of the range in terms of value homes in neighborhoods that have 600-700 properties for sale in the individual subdivisions that are completed. These builders have been going nuts over the last 18 to 24 months because there is no inventory available for people to buy whatever an affordable house is defined in Houston. It's somewhere between 250 and 400. I still can't get my mind wrapped around that's in any way affordable for most, but that's there. And then they come to market with interest rates that are lower than the market because they can buy the rate down. And so I just wanted to share this for a moment. And I think this probably, Scott, I think you said that these two candidates, maybe for this is not super common that we have a very clear housing policy that's out there, and both of these do. And I think it is to address a very real problem right now that we're seeing.
I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. And looking at your chart there, let's make no doubt about it. I think we are in for another housing bubble, particularly as it relates to transactions and loans that were originated during the pandemic, 2020 through, let's say, 2023, under some very suspect underwriting conditions. And I think we've already seen, some of those transactions go bad already. From what we understand, the number of repurchase requests from the GSEs has increased substantially. And in some cases, they're using the appraisal as the justification for that repurchase request. So, obviously, real estate's like any other market; it's cyclical. I think we're getting to the top of that cycle, and who knows when it's going to be. But I think that there, will be another housing bubble. Will it be to the extent that we saw in 2008 to 2010? I don't think so, but it's certainly, we're in for a correction here at some point.
It's almost like you joined our last podcast, Scott, or at least listened to it as we were talking about some of the contrast between the prior bubble in the great financial crisis, the GFC that Mark referenced in 07, 08, 09, contrasting that with where pricing is at today. Mark, it was interesting with that chart that you showed. Or is it your interpretation that where we're at today, is that an annualized pace of new units? Because Scott's saying that both the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign are targeting bringing on 3 million new housing units. And I assume that's over the 4-year period or term of their, a first anticipated term. It looks to me, if that's an annualized rate, that we're maybe already ahead of that, unless I'm misreading the chart that you've thrown up there, Mark.
No, I think the only difference would be, Jeff, it's affordable housing, particularly that the candidates are identifying is increased inventory or supply, where the chart that I showed is all inventory. And, there's plenty of the higher end stuff being built too, as Scott was alluding to.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting. We have in valuation this concept of the highest and best use, which means to the owner of the property, what's going to bring the maximum return, on whatever the possibilities are that they can do with a piece of land. And Scott's illustration of, hey, if I take down $1 million house and bring on, 3 or 4 or 5, $750,000 condos, that makes no dent, makes no difference doesn't help the affordability issue at all. And yet the private owner of that property is incentivized to maximize, the return, whatever it is. So, it may be that some incentives from a policy perspective are necessary in order to bring those to bring about the affordability stock that is what really is lacking in the moment.
Scott, yeah, a great point, Jeff. Scott, a general thought, and I think kind of the really unusual times that we have heading into this election cycle, and why housing is happens to be such a hot topic. Lucky us. But I think I've seen that Fannie is. I mean, we were kind of full of optimism going into the summer of this year, as rates were maybe going to tick down. We started to see volume increases. The builders were really going gangbusters with their rate buy downs. But it has optimism has cratered as far as I'm concerned. Certainly in the appraisal industry, in the space that I'm in, and I've seen Fannie suggest that 2024 may be the worst year for home sales since 1995. And I don't know if that is just total sales. My assumption is that it would be. And we had 261 million people in the country in 1995, 25% less than we do now. So I think it understates. If you just look at total home sales, it would understate the low number volumes that we're seeing. So, if you could spend a second looking at talking about kind of the unprecedented times that we're in here with low transaction activity and all.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting, Mark. I was talking with a colleague yesterday, and the Fed cut rates by 50 basis points a couple of weeks ago, and the 30-year mortgage rate now I think is somewhere over 6. It's actually gone back up. It came down
breaking news, Scott. I looked this morning, 6.92. We're almost over 7.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that the Fed is cutting rates, but because of the inflationary nature of some of the policies that are being proposed by both of the candidates, I think the markets are factoring in some more inflation. Not necessarily in the short term. I think we've got inflation under control for the most part. But in the long term, 15 years out, I think the markets are pricing in some additional inflation. So, yeah, 692, that's the highest I've heard in a while. But it's and if you think about it this way, Vice President Harris is proposing to give all first-time homebuyers $25,000 in first-time homebuyer credits, cash, to be able to purchase those properties. And that in itself is very inflationary because it isn't necessarily going to reduce the price of the property. The seller, I think, is going to recognize that buyers are coming to them with $25,000 additional cash and are going to increase the prices. So the housing component of the inflation index, I think, could take a hit if Vice President Harris were successful in putting in place that policy.
Scott, that is I've to our company on this podcast having a really hard time explaining. Generally bad news is good news for interest rates. We need things to get bad so that rates can come down, inflation and all. Being high or expected to be high is a component of rates just being stubborn. But I think that the policy, not just housing policies, but policies of both candidates, spend to get elected, proposed spending to get elected, is an interesting concept as to, look, this is going to be made worse by this election being over and somebody new getting in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, Trump is proposing to use the free market and a lot of tax credit programs where Vice President Harris is looking to inject a significant amount of cash into the system. So the tactics that they're using are very different. Trump wants to utilize the LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit programs, significantly more. And obviously, builders and developers would benefit from that. And like I said, Vice President Harris just wants to put cash in people's hands to be able to make purchases.
If you zoom out a little bit, Scott, I've heard the criticisms on both sides
15
for the Biden administration as well as the Trump administration in terms of a lot of spending and just things that would have inflationary pressures. And so what you're saying, and what I'm hearing at least, is what now Vice President Harris and Trump are proposing, and not just even maybe with housing, but maybe it's tariffs on the Trump side. Am I stating that correctly? I guess the first question, and secondarily, are there policies from one side or the other that would tend to be more inflationary? Meaning, do you think that interest rates are significantly different under one administration or the other?
Yeah, I obviously neither one of them is a fiscal conservative by any means, and the first Trump administration, I think, showed that very well, where he spent ungodly amounts of money. Now, many will argue that it was necessary because we were in the midst of the pandemic, and that it was necessary to make sure the country remained on a sound financial footing, and the $2 trillion or whatever it ended up being that he injected, it was necessary. But I think that he's probably going to do something similar to that, if he were to be elected a second time. It's just a matter of who's going to spend more. And I think Vice President Harris probably would spend more, but Trump would come in a very close second. And both of those scenarios are inflationary in nature. And like you said, it's not just in the housing sector, but in other policy areas as well, healthcare, transportation, all those different things.
Well, interesting. A couple of examples and a little bit of kind of research and specifics that I pulled together that I think just might be helpful for the viewer. One, I think VP candidate Walz, I guess, is how you describe him. I don't know. I'm not very political, so sorry about that. But he had a down payment assistance program in Minnesota, as I understand, and it was something like $20,000. my understanding, Scott, please correct me if you are aware of it and know of any different, but it's a 0 interest 30-year deferred mortgage for that down payment. Is that how you saw it?
That's what I understand. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and keep in mind that he signed several pieces of legislation into law to try to spur the construction of affordable housing through density bonuses, zoning changes. Well, this is in the city of Minneapolis specifically, but any parcel that was designed for residential uses could have up to as many as 6 units per parcel, and that's something that Governor Walz also proposed in the legislature. Now, it didn't necessarily go forward, but it is something that he's on record as having supported.
Great. Well, as I reviewed the Harris plan generally, you mentioned this low-income housing tax credits to provide developers incentives to build 1.2 million rental homes. The build to rent has been enormous source of construction, and I'm sure feeding that chart that I showed a little bit ago. And so that is certainly affordable, and I see a lot of what she's proposing is to build a lot of affordable housing, not just to own but to rent. So I see that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vice President Harris, I think, also is looking very closely at rent control, along with the construction of those units, where a Trump administration would be much more free market based. And I think we all know, the problems that are associated with rent control. So you've got, 2 competing factors there, one trying to spur the construction and one that is a disincentive to the construction of affordable rental units.
Yeah, one of the really interesting aspects of this that I saw was kind of going after, it was specifically quoted as private equity. Private equity would own rental units and has built some pretty innovative software to maximize rents. And I back why these aren't new. So when I used to rent apartments, I remember, the price would change each day based on their demand and the availability. It was actually quite impressive. But I thought it was interesting that that was kind of in the attack vector. So creating tax incentives for builders. This is all Harris plan who construct affordable homes for first-time home buyers. $40 billion to state and local governments for private developers, home builders through results-driven innovation funds. And then removing tax breaks for corporate housing buyers. That's really grown, over the last 8-10 years. Scott, how do you see that coming into play? These corporate buyers that are out there owning so much of the U.S. inventory.
Yeah, that's something that has been a factor and is growing in popularity, and obviously, corporate owners have the profit incentive and are taking those units out of circulation for potential home ownership and using them as rentals. And let's think about the long-term effects here. If you become a lifelong renter, you're not building generational wealth through real estate. So as the corporate interests come in and snatch those properties up, that's one less unit that is available for home ownership and to build that generational wealth. So, removing some of the tax incentives. I think Vice President Harris would propose that and is suggesting that she would propose that. And the one group that stands to benefit the most, I think, from either administration are the builders and the developers. They're going to come out fat and happy under a Trump administration or a Harris administration. There's just going to be a lot of money, a lot of incentives. Now, what they do with that will be interesting. As I've said a couple of times now, building more unaffordable housing doesn't solve this problem.
Jeff, one more thing. I know I'm sorry for dominating for a second, but another piece as I was researching the Walz, Minnesota down payment assistance was the confidence of collecting the down payment assistance back, at whatever time the loan was due. And it just spoke to people that have a stable housing and home situation, end up with more stable employment, end up with children who are more stable, get a more stable education, end up, and so it just breeds this stability for the citizen that may not be there to the same extent without home ownership. And so, a lot of really good, it seems to me, by both of these candidates trying to push policy to increase home ownership.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is somewhat of an emphasis on rental units as well, but they're both very interested in increasing home ownership for all the reasons that you just stated. One of the things that's kind of interesting, and this is a little bit of an aside, but both Trump and Harris are proposing to use vacant federal land to construct affordable rental properties. And where have we heard this story before? All the things that appraisers are dealing with right now in terms of redlining, segregated housing. When I heard some of these things, I'm like, all we're doing is going back to the policies in the Eisenhower administration that resulted in the creation of urban slums, to be perfectly honest. And if you're forcing people of limited means into rental housing that's clustered on let's say a former military base in a former federal building, whatever you want to call it, that's going to have some societal effects. And when I read that actually in both of their proposals, it was very curious to me that they want to go ahead and segregate those of limited means into rental properties that are clustered together.
Interesting.
Boy, yeah, and I get that. I think it's well intentioned. I would imagine that the desire is not to create an urban slum, and yet if it's not well thought through or executed, maybe there's no way to do it without having unintended consequences there, Scott. But so you're saying that under both of the administration's proposals, it would be rental housing specifically. It's not something they're looking to divide up and then sell off to first-time home buyers or something.
I think there would be a balance of both, but maybe a little bit heavier on the rental side. Just because that the requirement, the down payment requirements, and in California, in certain places in California, home ownership, even at prices that are, let's say, half of what the average home is in San Francisco right now, which is something like well over $1 million. So, okay, you cut it in half, it's $500,000. It's still out of range for most people. So I think there's going to be, some focus on rental there.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing we talked about, and then I wanted to just circle back to for a second, was this concept of private equity or corporate ownership of large swaths of rental properties. I've heard just loosely some proposed limitations or restrictions on how many units a single corporation or entity can own, whether within a state, I think, is what I'd heard most recently. Are you seeing any traction towards restricting that kind of activity in the market?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Trump's own family has precipitated that by some of the things that they have done with the large number of rental units that they have. There's a lot of documentaries out there about how one of the Trump sons, snatched up a lot of rental properties and was very predatory in how he treated the tenants. And if you believe what is said in the documentaries, there were some pretty bad things that were done. And, I think that has left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths for having rental units consolidated into a very few hands.
You bet. I haven't seen the documentary. Were the allegations that the actions taken were illegal, or is that spurning new tenant rights legislation or regulation?
Yeah, there were situations where, as I recall from watching the documentary, they would just pile on fees after fees after fees, late fees, late fees on late fees, fees for everything. And at that point, it just became unmanageable for the tenant, and ultimately, they were evicted. Maintenance in some cases of the rental units is a big issue for corporate landlords. They just have less of an incentive to keep the property up. They get their ROI and get out, regardless of the condition of the property, where a small owner is going to have an incentive to keep the property up. And some of the corporate landlords just don't take care of the properties, and literally the second you're late on your rent, if anything happens, you're not getting it fixed, and it just turns into these very dilapidated, poor living condition buildings.
Yeah, kind of a downward cycle. You're not paying the rent, so I'm not going to maintain the property, and it perpetuates itself.
We've spent a little bit of time detailing Harris's policies and kind of outlooks. I wanted to take a second and kind of, I don't really have specifics. It feels like at least the data I have from Trump is a little more macro rather than specific programs. But Scott, you've certainly brought up a few specific programs the Trump team has put together. But I have seen a thought that the Republican view is that the housing affordability issue is largely tied to inflation, overregulation, demand from illegal immigration. That was mentioned a lot in the vice president debate. And I thoughts, goodness, those are big topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Trump would be very myopically focused on reducing regulation. And one of the things that I read in getting ready for this session is that on the properties, the vacant military bases, vacant federal buildings, he literally wants to have no regulation on what can be constructed and how those properties can be constructed. Now, obviously, there's life safety codes that have to be followed and such. But other than that, if a developer can cram 10,000 units onto 5 acres, then by all means have at it. And to say that there's going to be no land use regulation in particular is going to be that's going to be interesting.
You bet. Boy, that sounds like interesting for sure. It seems like it feels like the Trump team would say that they are planning to drill for oil much more aggressively, and hope that lower energy prices are directly correlated to lower building costs. And so you might be able to attack affordability that way. Am I saying that correctly? Is that the view? What is your view?
Yeah, that's not something that I've looked at very closely in terms of how energy costs tie directly to housing affordability. But it makes sense. If you're reducing the cost of construction of materials and such, you're reducing the ultimate cost of the end product. And if you get rid of what they claim to be unnecessary regulations, construction regulations, let's say, then you've reduced the cost to the builder and the developer. My concern is that, okay, yeah, you reduce the cost to the builder and the developer. Do they actually does that translate into savings on the part of the renter or the buyer? And I'm not convinced.
Well, I appreciate that. I think there are. I mean, I think we have generally the notes I had here, and I just want to make sure we've covered them. But it's reducing mortgage rates by slashing inflation, federal lands, which we've sort of beat to death here. Promote homeownership through tax incentives for first-time home buyers, not dissimilar to down payment assistance, it seems, and then cutting unnecessary regulation. So I think those are the specifics in terms of housing. I think there are two big issues on my mind that we haven't touched on yet. and that is the views of either party on conservatorship with the GSEs and where we might end up there. It seems like Trump and team spent some time in the first term looking to address this. How do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Trump has already said that very early in his administration he would force the GSEs out of conservatorship, and Harris would probably maintain it, probably for some of the reasons that I mentioned previously about some of the risky loans that they have in their portfolio right now, or that they've packaged as mortgage-backed securities. So I think Vice President Harris is probably looking at it as still a very risky proposition, where Trump is looking at it and saying the GSEs are private enterprises, which they are. They happen to have the full faith and credit of the U.S. government behind them, and that's why they've obviously been in conservatorship since 2008. But ultimately, they need to be turned back over to the private market to continue their goal of maintaining liquidity in the markets. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of people think that the GSEs are in the business of encouraging home ownership, and that's not the case at all. That's not their role. The role of GSEs really is to maintain liquidity, and in doing so, to reduce the risk to the folks that are providing that liquidity, mainly investors. And the GSEs will tell you they are risk management companies, and that's all they are, in terms of reducing the risk to the providers of the money that they're putting into circulation for purposes of mortgage lending.
So GSEs, and by that we mean Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Are there others, or those two are the primaries that are in conservatorship?
Those are the two that are in conservatorship. I think that Ginnie Mae may also be considered a GSE. I'm not 100% sure on that, but obviously the two main ones are Fannie and Freddie.
What do you think the impact would be, Scott, of an exit from conservatorship in terms of its impact on the residential real estate market? Is there much of one? Does anything change in terms of liquidity availability, interest rates, or any impact there, do you think? I mean, this is speculating, obviously, but what's the difference between being in conservatorship
Yeah,
or not, you think?
I think their appetite for risk is going to change significantly, and they'd be, much more willing to take on excess risk than they are under conservatorship. Although some of the policies of their regulator have led to them taking on risk that they might not necessarily take on, and a lot of that actually is appraisal policy related, in terms of some of the appraisal waivers and such. But I think if they were unhandcuffed by FHFA, their risk profile would change significantly, and I think you would see the number of appraisal waivers go up fairly significant.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I was wondering what direction you thought that might go. I'm seeing, and in fact, at our appraisal board meeting yesterday, we saw the result of a complaint from one of the GSE, I think from Fannie Mae, that filed a complaint against an appraiser who had done an appraisal in our state and is resulting ultimately in discipline. Do you think that if they move out of conservatorship and take on a higher risk profile, does that put appraisers more or less in the crosshairs in terms of their likelihood of filing complaints on them?
I think it puts appraisers much more in the crosshairs because they're going to be taking on more riskier transactions. And when those transactions go into default, they are going to look specifically at the appraisal and the appraiser. And once they file that complaint with the state appraiser board, now they can go back to the lender and say, we found XYZ problems in the appraisal. We filed a complaint, therefore your underwriting was suspect, and we're going to ask and force you to buy back this loan. And so they, I think, will, take on a lot more risk, with the understanding that, yeah, some of those transactions are going to go bad, but they do have an off ramp to be able to get out of them.
That makes sense. Yeah, and that's an interesting question that comes up. Is that the general order that you see? GSE finds an issue, complains to the state, then uses that as the basis as a buyback request? Or does it go
That's
the
what
other way too, where they place a buyback demand and then refer that to the state?
I think it's the first scenario, where they file the complaint and then force, the buyback request. And, they say, we've found these errors in the appraisal. We filed the complaint. Therefore, your reps and warrants are no longer valid because, you sold us this loan with a bad appraisal. And therefore, and obviously, we all know that the appraisal probably had very little, if anything, to do with why the transaction went into default. It's certainly the errors that they find in the appraisals, probably have very little, if anything, to contribute to the reasons why it went into default. So, but it's something they have in the file that they can point to pretty clearly, and they have an avenue, to get justification, for the buybacks by filing these complaints. And they'll tell you that they are required by law, to file complaints if they find, errors in appraisals. And my understanding is that the errors have to be material, and have some impact on, the ultimate value opinion. But Jeff, I'm sure you've seen, in Utah some complaints that, are pretty minor, issues, very nitpicky, and wouldn't necessarily have an impact on the appraiser's ultimate value opinion.
That's exactly right, Scott. And in fact, sometimes the allegations are the appraiser used the wrong comparable cells, for that market. They're making that assertion based out of their national database and underwriting system, but without a local market, participant, asserting or affirming that. I had somebody reach out to me on that specific issue. Hey, they're saying I used the wrong comps, but I know what I did and why, and mine's on a rim, and the one across the street is not and doesn't have a view, and so I went to other view lots that maybe were further away, as an example. And so I think to your point, Scott, there are allegations of there are these deficiencies in the appraisal, but and it's not that they're always baseless, but I think the concern is how well they're vetted, or how substantive they really are. As I've talked to some real estate, some realtor groups, they oftentimes wonder, why does the appraiser do what they do, and why are they picking the comps that they're picking, and why do they adjust things the way that they do? And it's always insightful for them to realize that appraisers have a lot of scrutiny, not just when you first send that appraisal in and it goes through underwriting and they fund the loan, but the appraiser also has potential liability and scrutiny post closing. When a loan goes into default, Fannie or Freddie is then looking at the loan and saying, is there something in this appraisal that's wrong that we can go after as the basis for making this lender buy the loan back? And so it's a tricky situation that appraisers are in, and others in the process, once the deal's done, they get the money and on they go, but the appraisers still have, some potential liability.
And it's very interesting because in those cases, the comparables that are selected, out of, collateral underwriter, the GSEs assume that their comparables are correct and are the most appropriate comparables, and leave it to the appraiser to prove that the comps that they selected are at least as good, if not better than the comps that were selected. So the appraiser's in a very, disadvantaged position in trying to defend their comp selection, because the GSEs are saying, our model is better than anything that you could produce and any comps that you could select. But we'll listen to you. But we're assuming that our comps are correct, and if your comps don't look the same, then you're wrong.
Scott, it very much reminds me of filing my tax return and what it's evolved to over the last 7 or 8 years, where I know what you owe in taxes. The government says to me, I'm going to see if you do. You go ahead and tell me what you think, and then I'll tell you if you're wrong. by a series of unannounced letters occasionally throughout the years. And appraisal with the collateral underwriter feels a little bit like that in what you just described. I know the answer. Let me see if you do. And if you do, if your answer is different, I'll listen a little bit, but I am starting from a place of me being right.
And if you don't justify your comp selection, we're going to assume that they are improper comps and file a complaint against you.
Yeah. How difficult. Yeah. What a difficult. Okay. We've saved the juicy one for the end here, Scott. Other than your prediction on who wins the House and the presidential seat at the end here, but I don't know if you're willing to do that. But before that, appraisal policy and how this differs from either candidate. You can tell me. Let me set this up. I would assume that a Harris presidency would continue much of the policies, appraisal policies, related to appraisal bias. There's some housing policy related to kind of a climate change acknowledgement in the building industry. I would assume that those would continue under Harris. So please correct me as I wrap up here and turn it over to you if that's incorrect. All I have to go on is Dr. Ben Carson, who served as, I think, the housing secretary for Trump, has advocated to end, I'm quoting an article, end HUD's efforts under the Biden administration to address climate change issues and combat appraisal bias. For instance, and initiating a HUD task force consisting of politically appointed personnel to identify and reverse all actions taken by the Biden administration to advance progressive ideology. We are working through a lot of Biden initiatives over the last 4 years. What can we see as differences with these two parties?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think you're probably reading directly from Project 2025, and that's where Trump has said that he's going to reverse all of the actions of the PAVE task force on his first day or first month in office. I'm not sure, can't remember exactly which it was, but I think he needs to be a little careful with that because there's a couple of decent things that have come out of the PAVE task force. I think, my own personal opinion, the reconsideration of value process is going to be very helpful. I don't think it's going to result in a significant amount of work for appraisers, and I think it's going to do a lot to ferret out a lot of the frivolous and unsubstantiated complaints that are lodged with lenders in relation to their appraisal. So, the lender, the AMC, whomever else in the transaction is going to have a strong incentive to resolve those complaints at the ROV process, if not before, so that they don't result in a lawsuit, a complaint, or whatever. Now, in terms of the Harris administration, I agree that they will continue a lot of the same themes. Of course, she's been the champion of the appraisal bias issue as vice president, and I think that will continue. I don't think it's going to be as rigorous as it was, during the first 2 years, let's say, of the Biden-Harris administration. They very clearly are looking for an off-ramp from that conversation. They want to take credit for some of the things that they have done and move on. So the PAVE task force, from what we understand, is that their work has wrapped up. Their report is on the shelf, and some of the things that they suggested have been implemented or are in the process of being implemented, like the ROV process, like the reexamination of the college degree requirements, the ABM quality control standards, data being provided by FHFA and some others. And Vice President Harris has said, that they've eliminated the problem of appraisal bias in most states. And in other states, they've reduced it by 40 or 50%. I'm not sure exactly what they're basing their numbers on and how you make that calculation. But they very clearly are seeing, I think, that this is more of a systemic issue of real estate value inequities than anything that is related to appraisal, or even more so appraiser bias. Uh, what we're facing here is the result of decades and decades of very poor government policies that are having lingering effects. And to be perfectly honest, you change the rhetoric from appraisal bias to a conversation about real estate value inequities, and let's have that conversation. I think it's a very legitimate conversation, but don't shoot the messenger. Go back and look at the poor policies that were put in place by, quite honestly, by both Democrats and Republicans. There were some Republicans that put in place some pretty poor housing policies too. But like I said, if they just change the rhetoric a little bit, so I don't think a President Harris is going to be as focused the appraisal bias issue as much as President Biden has. Now, the difficulty is that the damage has already been done. And a lot of the same players would stay in the same positions or higher level positions than they are in now. And if Trump is elected, the 300 or so complaints that are pending against appraisers at HUD, nearly all of them go away literally overnight. While in a President Harris administration, many of them will remain active and potentially be prosecuted. But from what we understand, HUD is having a very difficult time finding any actionable evidence to go after appraisers, but they can't come out and say that. It's actually kind of interesting. I was reading the Fair Housing Act again a couple of days ago, and if they dismiss a complaint that's filed under the Fair Housing Act for whatever reason, and against whatever party, not just an appraiser, if they dismiss that case without any findings, they have to make that information public. And clearly, in this case, they're not going to come out. They don't want to come out and say, "No, this is all, this is all unfounded, unsubstantiated," because it wouldn't fit their narrative. So the bottom line is, I think, in a Harris administration, the issue stays around a little bit, to a little bit greater degree than Trump. With Trump, it goes away overnight. The problem is that we have a lot of these legacy issues. We just saw the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the appraiser in Colorado, the lender, and then AMC, and obviously that case is gonna linger. And I'm guessing that, especially if Trump wins in November, they're going to rush to file a lot of charges and complaints against appraisers just to get them in the pipeline before Trump becomes president.
Yeah, to the extent that if it exists where an appraiser is intentionally or overtly, misvaluing something because of a bias, I mean, action should be taken. But what I'm seeing you say, Scott, and what I've seen with complaints is that's not what's happening. Your analogy of don't shoot the messenger makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, a lot of times it's somebody who isn't hearing what they want to hear in terms of a value, and it doesn't have anything to do with the individual themselves. It's the data and the read on that market. And are some neighborhoods valued differently than others, based on what people are paying in those neighborhoods and markets? Yeah, for sure. It seems a little silly if I've got a big party planned this weekend and I'm going to be outdoors and the weatherman tells me that it's going to rain on me, to get really mad at the weatherman and try to file a lawsuit or something for him telling me something that's out of his control, but he's reading what the data is telling him. And it feels like appraisers have been a little bit in the crosshairs for a similar reason. You talked about the policies that led to some of the housing, maybe inequities, but reading the data and telling you what people are paying for homes in this neighborhood is so long as you're not intentionally doing it with bias or in an inaccurate or incredible way. It just is a little frustrating, I think, on the side of the appraisers. But it's something that I think, like you say, will have a real impact one way or the other, depending on who's sitting in the Oval Office next year.
It amazes me that brokers and salespeople have escaped scrutiny in the conversation about value inequities, because don't they list similar properties in different neighborhoods at different prices? But obviously, the realtors' large organization, very strong organization, they've been able to insulate themselves from any scrutiny on this. And for better or worse, the appraisal population is small. The profession is somewhat fragmented. And while I like to think that my organization, the Appraisal Institute, is effective in our advocacy efforts, we don't have nearly the prowess or the resources that the realtors have, and they've been able to protect themselves. And unfortunately, appraisers have taken it in the shins on this issue when there's in all but a very, very few circumstances, appraisers are not doing anything intentionally or inappropriate.
Well, Scott, what a conversation here. Thank you for making time for us in your busy schedule. I think we're really fortunate to have your perspective on an uncertain time, right? I think uncertainty is what we're all feeling, especially in the bad times. Uncertainty makes us worry, makes us concerned that how things going to be, and knowledge is power and key here. So thank you for that. You are a director of government affairs, work very closely with all of these folks. Everybody wants to know what your opinion is. Who's going to win this thing?
It's going to be kind of interesting. I haven't done the research, but my sense is that we could have both houses of Congress and the White House all flip. And I'm not sure there's ever been an instance where both houses of Congress and the White House have flipped in the same election. Wow. I think it's somewhat likely that Republicans take the Senate, although that's becoming a little bit less clear in one of the battleground states, actually the state where I live, Maryland, where the Republicans were hopeful to be able to pull off a switch there. And that's becoming a little bit less likely at this point. And that was one of the key factors. But it's still very possible that the Republicans could take the Senate. I think it's very possible that the Democrats take the House. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that Trump wins the White House. Now, I will tell you that, got a coin, flip it, because I'm not exactly sure at this point. I have to think that Harris probably has the advantage a little bit, but the polls are neck and neck, especially in some of the 7 or so swing states that are out there. So we may not know for quite a long period of time, like in 2020, who the ultimate victor is going to be. Obviously we'll know which party is going to control the Senate, which party is going to control the House, but I'm not sure we're going to know for a long time. When does the Electoral College meet? December 6th, I think, somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. So we'd have to know between November 5th and whatever date that is. And like last time, they may take it right up until the last minute before we know, who the ultimate victor is. And it's all complicated by, mail-in ballots now and early voting. And that actually helps the situation a little bit because they're able to they can't process those ballots before Election Day, but they're able to process them very quickly after the polls close. So I think early voting and mail-in voting are helping to try to solve the problem of having to wait to get an answer. But we're not going to know for quite some time, I don't think, who ultimately is going to be the next president.
Does that, I guess the last question that comes from that, and thank you for that answer, is if it is split between the presidency and the houses, these policies that we've talked about here, is there a more stagnant, or I don't know if the right word, but less polarized policy differences to the extent there are polarized differences?
It's kind of interesting because obviously, most of the discussions on the valuation bias topic have been taking place in the House. There's been some conversations, but not nearly as to the degree as in the Senate. So if the House goes back to being Democrat and Maxine Waters now becomes once again the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, and let's say Trump wins the White House, so the conversation just shifts up Pennsylvania Avenue to Capitol Hill, and the House Financial Services Committee becomes the focus of the conversation. We've had two hearings on this issue in the last 7 or 8 years, And I think that there would be, more hearings that Congressman Waters would want, Chairwoman Waters would want to have. So it's very interesting to see how the parts are moving. And, if the Democrats keep the Senate and the Democrats take the House, then the conversation probably, takes place a little bit, to a little bit greater extent in both chambers. And, of course, if the Democrats have the trifecta, then, we're going to have both the administration to deal with as well as Congress.
Wonderful. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time, for being here. This is really valuable. Maybe we need to pick up the conversation once we have a little more certain way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And even more so once we have a good handle on who some of the appointees are going to be in the administration, who's going to be at CFPB. I believe that Director Chopra's term, that's a nonpartisan position. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but I think he serves a 5-year term, and I think he's coming to the end of his term. So there'll be somebody new there. Obviously, there could be a new secretary at HUD, new FHFA director, and some other agencies as well. So, and that has a lot to say about what the policies are going to be and how those things, various issues are going to be handled.
Wonderful. Well, safe travels out there.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Mark, are you going to make a prediction, Mark?
No.
As we close out, I'll just tell you this story. I listened to a comedian who was saying, I think at the Trump and Clinton election night, he talked about going to a party. He's like, have you ever gone to a party that all of a sudden turned into not a party as it became apparent that what everybody assumed that Hillary was going to win, and then Trump ends up winning, and all these people that were there for this Clinton political party kind of get depressed and go home or whatever. It's kind of funny. I hope it's decisive enough that we don't have to have a drawn out battle, whatever the outcome is here. But
and it's not out of the realm of possibility that there could be a tie too. There's a lot of scenarios that give each of them 270 electoral votes. So it's a very, and it could come down to the 2 congressional districts that have their electors separate. The first district in Nebraska, the Omaha area, and then there's Maine awards their electoral votes on a district basis, congressional district basis too. So there's a couple of different scenarios out there, all very interesting.
Never a dull moment.
yes, high. That's all I'm hoping for.
All right. Well, take care, Scott. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to potentially having another conversation with you after the election.
Sounds great.
Would love it.
Take care.
Awesome. Thanks.